The Reserve Bank of New Zealand just recently reduced interest rates for the first time in over 4 years. Many economists are now expecting house prices to stop falling and show modest rises from here. However, there's some serious reasons why New Zealand's house price falls may not only continue, but could actually accelerate. And if this happens, it might just be a major warning for the Australian housing market. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. What has 5 toes but isn't your foot? My foot. And just like you need feet, you need to be listening to the absolute best content on YouTube. So if that's the case, don't bloody subscribe to me. But if you want some pretty good content on the financial markets, like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Together, we can keep ourselves up to date on all the important stuff that affects our lives. Now let's have a look at the New Zealand housing market, look at all the reasons why house prices may continue falling, and consider if Australia will be next in line. Here's the average house prices in New Zealand, and as you can see, the pandemic was the perfect opportunity to artificially inflate house prices. It happened in Australia, it happened in Canada, and most certainly it happened here in New Zealand. But unlike Australia, New Zealand house prices actually fell and they stayed down. They rose slightly in 2023 and have just started falling off again in 2024. Now let's go through all the reasons why New Zealand house price declines could continue and even potentially accelerate. First, New Zealand's interest rates are bloody high. Even after the interest rate cut, they're still sitting at a 5.25 cash rate, whereas Australia is currently sitting at 4.35. So New Zealand would need another 425 basis points cuts just to be lower than Australia. This shows you that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand were much more aggressive with interest rate hikes, so now they can comfortably cut rates, but it would take a crap load of cuts before rates get low enough to really start increasing speculative demand for property. The RBA in Australia, on the other hand, get blasted by the media, get blasted by politicians because Australia is absolutely desperate to keep this housing bubble going, whereas New Zealand seem to take a tougher approach and don't seem to care if house prices come under pressure. Secondly, New Zealand's economy has been going backwards, which means financial hardship has been increasing. As you can see from this chart, real GDP has fallen significantly, but very shockingly, gross national disposable income has really plummeted and is now sitting way below pre-COVID levels. So when the economy is weak like this, it massively affects individuals because they have less disposable income to spend in the economy. And when there's less spending going on, businesses receive less income coming in, and that means they have to be much more careful with their expenses, which usually means they're careful with how many employees they hire, and this just leads to more weakness in the overall economy. And when the overall population is doing worse financially, it impacts the number of people looking to buy houses. Whether it's investors or people trying to buy their own home, a weak economy affects the majority of the population. Next, New Zealand's migration levels are falling sharply. This is another area that's unlike Australia, who talk about getting immigration levels under control, but month after month, the levels seem to remain extremely elevated, extremely elevated, extremely elevated. Echo. New Zealand has 2 factors affecting this. Here we've got new arrivals into New Zealand declining sharply, and in the dark blue we've got departures from New Zealand increasing sharply. So the orange line shows net migration levels, and it's really taken a dive over the past year or so. Now, high levels of immigration add a massive amount of demand for property, and that's because every person needs a place to live. Even though many Australian commentators say immigration levels have no impact, they're bloody well wrong. Basic supply and demand economics asserts that if there's more demand for a product or service, that puts upward pressure on pricing, whereas if there's less demand for a product or service, it puts downward pressure on pricing. Take rents, for example. If there's a large amount of available places to rent, landlords simply can't ask for too much rent because a renter has many other options where they can get a cheaper price. But if there's hardly any places to rent, landlords can pretty much ask whatever they want, because if you don't have a safe and secure place to live, you'll pay anything out of desperation. So when Australia keeps immigration levels ultra high during the middle of a housing crisis, they're basically giving the middle finger to renters. Another area which will cause continued downward pressure on house prices is the large number of available properties for sale in New Zealand. The current levels of housing stock is considered unusually high, and not just that, it actually seems to be growing. This is another very sharp contrast with Australia, where property listing levels have been abnormally low since the pandemic, and the impact on prices is obvious. When there's more stock available, buyers have more negotiating power, and when buyers have the power, sellers often have to reduce their prices to meet what the buyer's willing to pay. Next, we have unemployment. Prior to the pandemic, the unemployment rate in New Zealand was just above 4%. But as you know, we flooded the economy with too much money. Unemployment fell sharply, but since then has been coming back to reality and is now sitting at 4.6%. Now, unemployment levels have a massive impact on house prices. Because mortgages are so high today for new home buyers, you basically have to be working to be able to make the repayments. But what happens if you lose your job and you can't find another one quickly? Well, that's the scenario that could actually lead to a house price crash, because a real crash typically involves people being forced to sell their house because they can no longer afford their mortgage repayments. So if the New Zealand economy actually gets weaker, this could lead to more layoffs, which leads to higher levels of unemployment, which could accelerate house price declines and could actually lead to a housing crash. The unemployment rate in Australia is sitting at 4.2%, which is less than New Zealand, but has been trending upwards. Australia is benefiting from having a larger and more diversified economy, which so far has meant they've been able to absorb mass levels of immigration and keep the unemployment levels fairly low. However, these mass immigration levels could backfire for Australia, because if the economy experiences real weakness, there's a lot more people here who could become unemployed, and that could affect the economy and in turn house prices. Lastly, policymakers in New Zealand seem a lot more determined to improve housing affordability rather than Australia. Here's some examples of New Zealand policymakers stating that they'd actually like to see house prices decline.
Housing's too expensive in New Zealand.
Price needs to reduce.
We want housing to be more affordable for New Zealanders. Average house prices to average household income are too high. By any objective measure, they are severely unaffordable by international standards. The flip side of house prices falling for people who own homes is that they become more affordable for people who don't own homes. And there is a whole generation of young New Zealanders who have been locked out of the housing market because average house prices are too high.
Now, this sort of talk is staggering to an Australian, because the culture here seems to be higher prices at all costs. If an Australian policymaker was to suggest that we need lower house prices, they'd probably be locked up in jail.
Lock you up forever.
That's how bad the property obsession is here, where an entire country is willing to sacrifice future generations just so they can keep making abnormal and unrealistic gains from property. Yes, New Zealand has started cutting interest rates, but that might not be enough to stop further house price declines. In fact, there's potential for those declines to accelerate. This is a warning for Australia, who's experienced the same housing bubble as New Zealand. I'm Biko Konstantinos.